Hi, it's Dr. B, and today is a part one of research methods video on secondary research. We will talk about, when we think about research methods, a lot of the time, especially in a class where we're talking about science and technology, we might think things like experiments in a lab. But research is a part of all professional and academic fields, and research is a big part of writing. We sometimes don't think of research as a part of writing, but writing itself is often thought of by people in my field as a form of research in and of itself. So we'll talk about research methods as they relate to writing a few times this semester, and today is part one, secondary research. This may be a review for a lot of you. It may be new to some of you. That's okay. But even if it's a review for you, I hope that there may be one or two things in here that kind of make you think about secondary research a little bit differently, maybe than you have in the past. So the big picture, in general, when we think of research, I think a lot of times we try to conjure up a really specific method in our head. So for me, as someone who has a science background, that usually is turning test tubes magenta for 4 years, or, doing something with, when I was testing for STDs, at the public health department, anything that involves a test tube and some reagents, and some enzymes, some spectroscopy. But in general, research is a more umbrella kind of endeavor than that. It really is just the process of developing a question, a really good question that sometimes we think we want to know something, and we just start kind of figuring it out. But to really know what we think we want to know, we have to develop really good questions. We have to ask the right questions. So it's the process really of just developing a really good question to help us figure out something that we want to know, and then generating information, generally, or data very generally, to answer that question or those questions. So really, that's it. I have a question, I have to develop a really good question and figure out a way to generate information and data, and then come up with, hopefully, either the answer to my question, or I'm going to have to revise my questions. How you generate that information or data, which I sometimes use those terms interchangeably, is what classifies the research as either primary or secondary. It's not how important it is, it's just how you generate that information. Secondary research is just as important as primary research. I think when I was in sciences as an undergraduate, I had a little bit of a bias, thinking primary research was more important, but neither one of them is more important than the other. And primary research is not inherently better than secondary research. You can have some really bad primary research. Both are really, really important. And so really it's just how you generate that information is what classifies them as distinct from each other. Sorry. Okay. So, the types of research, I'm sure this is something you've heard before. Primary is when you, I hate to say conduct the research yourself. That's usually how we think of it. I mean, we do actually conduct secondary research, but the idea is that you're doing something to generate the data, primarily meaning you're the first one to do it. So think of it as levels, primary being like a level that is not, very far removed. So you're very close to the data because you've done something to generate it yourself. You've written that down in your laboratory notebook. You're the first one who's come up with this information. We can generate do primary research to generate data in a lot of different ways. Interviews, for example, are very common in all fields, probably not in science. I don't know, social sciences probably, but interviews, surveys, focus groups, prototyping, usability testing, scientific experiments. There are so many different types of ways to generate, primary data. In writing, primary data tends to come about either because we're writing up maybe an experiment that we've done, or using methods such as like interviews or focus groups or surveys, or things like rhetorical analysis is also a type of primary research. Secondary research is research that you're doing that relies on synthesizing what other people have done, or building on what other people have done. It's still like you doing the research. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about secondary research, is that you're not actually doing research, or that it's not original. It is still original in that you're taking what is published, what's out there, data that other people have published from their own primary research, and you're still doing something original with it. You're not just copying and pasting what they've done. That would be plagiarism. So and there's so much information out there, and any one particular source can be used in multiple ways. So what you're doing is coming up with an original question, and then you're delving into the data or information that has been published, and you're synthesizing it to build on what has come before, or to come up with something original and new. So it's still original. This is one of the huge problems I see as a writing teacher, and as a professional writer, when people start working with secondary research, is that they stay too close to what that primary research says, and they don't think of it as their own original research. This is still your original research. You're just using data that's already published. And though in some fields that's looked down upon, it's actually a good thing, because the whole point of research and scholarship and getting things out there is to build on what's come before. All right, so examples of secondary research. One of the most common are literature reviews. These are different in different fields. A literature review in a science field is a little bit different than the way we would think of a literature review in the English related, writing fields. But literature reviews, a review article, very common in the sciences, especially. Literature reviews are probably more common maybe in English. They're related, but slightly different. And then, a literature review can be part of a paper. And then a meta-analysis is also a very common one when you go and find data that's already been published, and you, within the confines of what's allowed and proper in statistics, you pool it, sorry, I have an accent, and analyze it. And meta-analyses have become really, really vital in the era of big data, and they can go horribly wrong, and I have a lot of criticisms of them, but they're also really good because it gets people inspecting other people's data, and we can find that there's really good data out there that is reliable, and there's not very good data that's not reliable. And if people weren't doing meta-analyses, I don't think we would notice that as much. Okay. All right, so the process is pretty simple. Most people think of it as a straight line. I have a question, I'm going to go find some information, I'm going to answer that question. And that is just not true, especially when we're writing as part of our research process. It's very iterative. So we'll come up with a question, we'll go search for sources, read through those sources, evaluate them. And a lot of times we figure out, oh my gosh, I'm not actually answering my question, or I'm finding a whole lot of stuff that I don't know is relevant, like what's going on. And so we have to constantly refine our questions. And then there's a process we do ourselves when we're learning something through the research process. You don't necessarily write it up that way. Even as we're writing, we're going to figure things out and have to refine stuff. So this is a constant cycle. You're not really done until the thing is written up and turned in. And even then you might be inspired to keep working on it. So you start with searching for sources, reading it, and evaluating them, but do not be discouraged if halfway through your assignment you find out you need to go and look up some more sources because you have a question. Or if you get started searching for sources and you find 1,000 sources, then your scope is too large. Do not feel discouraged. Just refine those questions. Reading what is out there helps us to refine. People are sometimes, and I know that I've had to battle this myself, afraid to look what other people are doing. We want to have original ideas that are exciting. And so sometimes we're really resistant to figuring out what's already out there because we can feel discouraged that someone else has already figured it out. I had a professor that once said to me, you don't have to be the first, you just have to be the best. There are so many questions out there in so many sources, and you can get really inspired. If you read a source that does exactly what you thought you wanted to do, sometimes that can inspire you to refine your idea and make it more specific and make it unique. So don't be afraid of this process. All right, we'll talk more about this as we go through the semester, but I wanted to sort of mention that secondary research in our writing, not just as a research process prior to writing, but as we're integrating research in our writing, it can serve similar but different purposes depending on who the reader is. One of the things that we're working on in this class is tailoring our writing to our readers, and understanding that we are stakeholders in our own writing, but we're not writing for ourselves. We might start off that way in early drafts, but when we write something, the purpose is to communicate it to a reader, and our reader has different needs than we have, especially in the research project. or process, because we know in our heads what we're doing. And by the time we sit down to write, we've usually, some of that stuff has become tacit. And so we forget to make it explicit. Our readers have different needs than we do. And so we have to think about not just secondary research, how we're using it for ourselves as researchers, but how we're going to put it into our writing for readers. Sometimes people are frustrated with, like, maybe a peer reviewer comes back and says, you need to integrate a source. Why do I need to do that? I know this. Well, sure you do, but your reader doesn't. So sometimes we have to put sources in there for our readers. So for us, we might start off reading secondary research just to answer some questions, to learn more about a subject because we're interested in it, or, because we're data mining, we're looking for data or information. Secondary research can help us to design methods. When I was working in a laboratory once, my PI tasked me with replicating a method that had been published in a journal, where the authors had created a method for creating a cell line out of sea turtle samples. And they were the only lab to have ever done so. So I had to really delve into their research to design method to do that same thing that would work for our lab. And then also, to design assays and things like that that would work for what we were trying to do. So looking what others have done and been successful at, and adapting that to your own work is really helpful. To support our argument or claims, one of the things I think we often forget about research, it's not the subjective process that's just revealing something that happened in the world. Those of us who grew up in the sciences were taught that, but when you're writing it up, it's an argument. You're making a claim that's arguable. You're trying to back that up with evidence. And so sometimes we have to build up our credibility. If you're not, world famous in your field, just your credibility and ethos is not going to get you through. So we have to borrow that credibility and shore it up, either by relying on existing research that helps to demonstrate what we're saying, as evidence to back up our claims. And obviously to build on to previous work. The whole point of research and publishing it, it's not just because we're interested in it. I mean, it starts off that way, but we want to share those results to make a change in the world. And to do that, other people have to build on what's come before. And that means we have to build on what's come before. So you have to answer that question for yourself of, why does this matter? And how does this fit into what other people have done on the same thing? For our readers, it can, again, they're similar but different. You may not need a whole lot of background information, but your reader does. You can't assume that even people within your own field study the exact same thing as you. So sometimes you have to give a quick survey of background information in your field, and that's going to depend on who you're presenting to. If you're a biochemist who works on, enzymes in cyanobacteria, presenting at a conference to other biochemists who work on cyanobacteria, you're going to have a much less background information that you have to provide. If you're a biochemist who works with cyanobacteria and you're presenting at a conference of biochemists from a lot of different fields who work on a lot of different things, then you're going to have to provide some more background information, And then if you're a biochemist who works on cyanobacteria, who's presenting to a mixed field conference of people from all different backgrounds in science, you're going to have a lot more background information. So that scope increases. You have to also establish relevance to your reader. Why should your reader care? We can't take that for granted. We have to convince them why. Sometimes we can use secondary research to help with this. To provide details, like examples. When we write, we need to be very specific. We don't want to talk in general terms. So we may know kind of an idea, but kind of, have trouble putting our finger on exactly what, something is. You can go find an anecdote, a detail, something specific from another source to use as an example. And again, credibility, not just for ourselves, but think about who your readers find credible. If your readers, are really familiar with the field, like in my field, for example, depending on where I'm publishing, I will use different sources. So for example, I once wrote a paper for a conference on ethos, but I'm not a classical rhetorician. And so I was relying on someone named Nedra Reynolds, who's a feminist author, and she talks about ethos quite often. And so in literary circles or in postmodern circles or in feminist circles, Nedra Reynolds is a great source to use. She's very credible. But if you're trying to publish that same paper, in a classical rhetoric conference, they're not going to go for it. They're going to want to talk about Aristotle, so, and maybe some other people. But think about who your readers find credible. Sometimes we have to choose sources and integrate them just for that reason. All right, y'all. So this is very general and maybe obvious, but we use secondary research in a lot of different ways. It's not just part of the research process, but when we integrate it into our writing, we're mining it for information, or supporting our argument, or we're, kind of situating our work. So it's kind of a sum up of the very general reasons why we might undergo the act of secondary research or incorporate it in our writing. You want to pick sources, be strategic. So when you're first starting in that process, you're just kind of reading everything to figure out, what you're trying to do, or because you're learning, but you can't include everything. Like, you could read 100 articles, that doesn't mean you should include 100 articles in your secondary or your literature review, or, integrate it into your writing. You have to resist that pressure to include everything. You have to be strategic when writing. Obviously, if you use information from a source, you always cite it because you don't want to plagiarize. But in general, if you're like, oh my gosh, how do I choose of all of these sources to use? Here are some guidelines, give it a job. So you can use a source to help you define or describe a concept or a method, to provide a story or an anecdote or a specific detail, to provide an artifact for your primary analysis. So the act of finding things that are already published as secondary artifact then becomes the foundation for your own primary analysis, if you're into rhetorical analysis or content analysis, things like that. To establish validity or relevance of your work, or the significance of it, the scope and the significance of your work, to illustrate a point, to provide answers that your reader may have questions. And even though you don't have those questions, your reader does. And so you need to answer those questions. Or maybe there's a problem that's arisen and you need to provide a solution. To show trends or patterns is really, really common. I think those of you in any English related degree or field have probably done a literature review and articulated themes and trends. This is usually in a larger literature review section, but it's also true of a review article. Or to guide your research design, or to aid you in interpreting your data and results. Sometimes we have to develop not just a method for gathering the data, but a scheme for interpreting it. So, what's your rubric, for example, for coding data and then interpreting it. And I'm sure there are many, many others. Those are just some that I thought about. So when we're applying this to your assignment, which I'll record a separate video kind of going over that, depending on which option that you're still going to do secondary research for your research letter, but depending on which of the three options you choose, you'll do more or less of it. So even if you're going to do the compare and contrast or the analysis type option, you'll still want to use secondary research to provide you with some background information, to answer your own questions, and then also to situate your work for your reader. For example, you may not know very much about anti-racism in scholarly publishing, or you may not know a whole lot about social justice, and that's fine. The whole point of this is to learn, and that's what research is, right? So I'm tasking you with, the question is, hey, how does social justice in any way intersect with scholarly publishing in the sciences? And you're probably like, I have no idea. Great, that's what research is for. So it's very broad. You can narrow it down, but you'll have to go seek out that information. You also could write, if depending on which option, you're going to probably have a short literature review in your research letter, either maybe as it could be the entire focus of the letter if you're doing that option, or it could be like a little bit of literature in your introduction, or if you wanted to create a separate little section, that's fine. This synthesizes current findings in this area. What are other scholars doing or writing about in terms of anti-discrimination efforts in publishing, either in general or in sciences or whatever, or to help you develop a method for analysis. Okay, so maybe you want to do a rhetorical analysis of some existing anti-discrimination guidance on a publisher's website. There's a million ways you could do that. Maybe there's a published paper where someone did something and you want to repeat that same kind of method. So the secondary source can help you with that. or to help you find an example, or something like that. So there's a lot of different ways you could incorporate secondary research into this assignment. But then remember that this is your original research. You're not just summarizing what other people have told me. That's really not the purpose of secondary research. Too many people make that mistake. I don't know. I think I even had that idea for a long time. I thought if someone else had already done it, then it wasn't original. But it's your work. You're synthesizing it and applying it in a unique and new way. So think about what you really want, what insights you really want to focus on. So you'll analyze examples, you'll synthesize this information, and you'll generate your main findings or insights. And just remember that if you're doing the rhetorical analysis option, that is a form of primary research, but the examples that you're analyzing are actually part of your secondary research. So there's not always a very clear line between those two. So I hope this was helpful to you. I'm going to, and if you have any questions, please check out the video where I talk about, the assignment in a little bit more detail, but you can also reach out on the discussion forums or email me if you have any questions. Thank you very much.